Thank you, Ian. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you, all of you, for coming here today in this virtual space. I wish I could be there in person, of course, but one day. And also I wanted to thank Mary Bosworth for originally sending me the invitation, and Angela and everyone else who was part of organizing this. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background on this project, how it fits into my larger program of research, and then get to some of the key conceptual framings I'm using, and discussion of the ethnographic material and archival material that I've been gathering in India over the last, say, 15 years or so. So as Ian mentioned, my first monograph was an ethnography of police work and life in northern India, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is India's most populous state. I think the number is around 200 million people, so it would be, I believe, the sixth largest country in the world if it were a sovereign nation state. And they have what I believe still is the largest police force under a single command, a director general in the world. So while I was doing field work with police there in Uttar Pradesh, which we say UP, and just, spending kind of every day with police at the station, on the beat, just in their kind of quotidian spaces, I learned about an event that had happened, well, at that time, some 30 years earlier in 1973, which was essentially an uprising of police constables who were protesting their working conditions. And it was this kind of taboo subject. I would initially hear about it kind of in whispers, but the more people that I spoke with about it, and I did end up at that time, this was in 2006 and 2007, interviewing about a dozen former constables who had actually participated in the event. I learned there was still a lot of dispute about, how it had come to be, where it started. Some constables even claimed it was a conspiracy to frame them and make them look like they were at fault by senior officers. It's kind of an analogy to the way, like Black Bloc protesters and kind of violent forces coming in from the state. Today, people talk about that as, one of the key factors behind protests. So I became very interested in the event itself, but also in, what was behind it. And I spoke not only with constables, but also with senior officers who, in a way that, rose a lot of questions for me. They were kind of the enemy themselves. And so, in terms of the constables saying, it's the senior officers that are really at fault for, everything that's wrong and our poor living and working conditions. And now many of the senior officers did say, look, yes, the rank and file, who make up more than 90% of the police in India, they do have legitimate work-related grievances that demand redressal. And yet, not only senior officers, but just senior officials of the state more generally continue to produce and support all kinds of legal limits, administrative, legislative, and executive, as well as judicial pronouncements, but legal limits on the right of police to form unions or to have any kind of organized collective voice that might allow them to express their grievances and negotiate for change. So what I've tried to do is to analyze this kind of tug of war over police worker rights in India as a form of what I'm calling lawfare. Now, you've probably heard this term before. It's now widely in use. And as I looked into the emergence of the idea of lawfare, I found kind of two main schools of thought that actually haven't been really in explicit dialogue, but I'd like to put them into dialogue. Since one of them arose actually among North American military and legal scholars, say early in the 21st century. This is just generally, this conceives the idea of lawfare as using law as a weapon of war. That is, of realizing some kind of military objective. So there's actually, some of you may read it, a lawfareblog.com that developed, I think around 2010. They publish on a range of issues related mostly to US-centric debates around national security. And the idea is that the contributors want to promote reliance upon law to defeat people both inside and outside of government who would scorn the law. And I highlight that to show how this idea of lawfare can work on multiple scales, both for and against state officials, whose actions may seem to express contempt for the rule of law, and not only in the military. I think also what's crucial about this idea of lawfare is that it assumes a kind of a structural dialectic of domination and resistance. So there's a zero-sum game that will eventually result in some victor and some loser, depending on who weaponizes law more or less successfully. But there's a different idea of law and lawfare, which some of you may be familiar with, that actually arose in parallel with this idea that came out of, again, mostly military legal scholarship in the US. And this was put forth by John Komaroff, an anthropologist whom you've probably heard of. And he wrote about it first in a foreword, actually, to an issue of the journal Law and Social Inquiry, a special issue that was related to, I think it was Colonialism, Culture, and the Law was the title. And so in this foreword that Komaroff wrote, he said that essentially lawfare, it acknowledges the law's contestatory possibilities as both an instrument of top-down dominance, but also a bottom-up weapon of the weak. So this is still in keeping with that dialectical logic I mentioned of dominance and resistance. But what Komaroff wanted us to do was, I think, also think about the way law can represent not just a weapon or a technology, but also a mutating and a kind of always already transforming social field, which subjectivizes people or subjectifies people over time. So I'm picking up on Komaroff's idea to suggest that we need to move beyond this idea of lawfare as simply a tool in a kind of domination and resistance dialectic, so that we can think about how law, again, as a processual social field, works in different ways to configure or, again, subjectify certain kinds of actors. And also, of course, how law has been critical both to maintaining structural power inequalities, but also transforming them. So this is how I'm using this idea of lawfare. And what I want to argue is that ongoing lawfare in postcolonial India has worked now for more than a century to subjectivize rank and file police legally and politically as an exploited and expendable labor force of people who are security laborers, who are, again, as I've just described, barred from any kind of collective activity that might advance both their own welfare, but also social justice for all. So just a quick bit on my methods. I've been doing ethnography in Northern India now since 2004. So in addition to drawing on, I don't know how many pages of field notes of participant observation, I've also conducted scores really of interviews with a host of actors, and also done a lot of content analysis of archival texts. So I want to talk a little bit, before I get into the empirical material, I want to speak a bit about this idea of policing as work and this idea of security labor that I'm using. Because as I think we all know, there's this indeterminate kind of multiplicity of tasks that public police are demanded to do. And of course, nowadays, we know this is a key factor in all of these debates around things like defunding or abolishing police, or even just, the more traditional debates around reform. So I think we still have a lot of work to do to conceptualize, what police work actually is, work qua work. And we often don't think about it in terms of labor. Of course, there is I think, a very well-established literature on policing as a profession and the historical process of the professionalization of public police, especially in the Anglo-American sphere. And there's also some good historical and sociological work on police unions, although as many scholars have noted, police unions are still a very understudied sector of labor in particular. So with this idea of professionalization, we had processes of bureaucratization, legal protections coming in to insulate police from the vagaries of politics, and of course more of an emphasis on things like forensics and policing as a science. And at the same time, there also arose this idea, following on, kind of a Weberian idea of bureaucracy that, police should be impersonal, depoliticized, and devoted to procedural justice. And yet, of course, I think, as we all know, policing never has been completely divorced from politics, arguably never will be. And it's important to think about policing, as a political set of forces and relations, not only in, kind of top-down way, where there's, say, government interference or oversight or shaping of police practice, but the direction I want to think more in is a kind of bottom up, like how do rank and file police act on a variety of political agendas? So as I mentioned there, we do have some literature on not only police unions, as a kind of organizational dynamics, but also historical instances of police strikes. And not surprisingly, politically, of course, there are very mixed responses to the idea of police unions and how much or even whether they should be included under the larger umbrella of organized labor globally. I think you can certainly find across the political spectrum, left, right, whatever, at the very least, a sort of cautious feeling that, police politics, if you will, or labor politics should be restricted, that they should not be allowed to strike. If police unions are under the umbrella of organized labor at all, they're usually perceived as these kind of odd bird splinter groups and such. So we still have this very thorny problem, I think, of defining what exactly it is that constitutes police work as labor, or should we even talk about police work as labor? And that's something that I do want to do here, because I think often police work as work, it gets reduced, and we've seen this even recently in works like Mirko Siegel's book, on violence workers. It just gets reduced to coercion by violence. And I think there are a lot of ways that, just saying the raison d'etre for police is state violence elides the other kinds of labor that police are doing. And it also elides the fact that there are very real demands by the public for these various forms of labor in the name of realizing security, whatever that may mean and whomever it may serve, or whomever it may harm in a specific time space. So again, I want to think about police work as a particular form of security labor that will always be in demand. and obviously in contexts where there are a host of social inequalities, power asymmetries, etc. So in the time I have remaining, I want to talk specifically about how this is working in the context of post-colonial India, where rank and file police workers find themselves not only constructed as depoliticized security laborers, that is, they're kind of living and working outside this imagined community of the demos, of the public in the democracy. But moreover, they're ironically exploited by various kinds of powerful officials, including and especially their immediate bosses in the police hierarchy, but not only those, but other elites. And they're exploited in ways where they don't have any kind of recourse for, again, trying to secure their own rights in accordance with organized labor or even with the voting public. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of this, of how this came to be, as well as how these anxieties, public anxieties around police work as security labor have manifested in what I'm calling lawfare. So in short, the foundations of policing, as some of you may know if you've studied anything about the place, they were founded in the mid-19th century while still under colonial rule. Specifically, they followed the 1857 rebellion of soldiers, indigenous troops in the then British Indian Army. There was a police commission that was made up of both military and civil colonial administrators. That was established in 1860 with two primary mandates. The first was to basically reduce the number of native troops, as they were then known, to, you might put it another way, civilize security administration. And they needed to do this by first maximizing the labor output of this new civil police force, while also minimizing expenditure on their welfare. The old keep costs down so we can maximize revenue and profit. They also needed to make sure that they could more generally prevent any kind of collective discontent, not only among these new civil police, but also still among the military soldiers. And so there was a way in which this new police force framed its workers, again, as expendable, right? That, it didn't really matter. There was a way in which actually they said in the commission that the police needed fewer reliefs than the military soldiers because it was a less disciplined kind of force. So there was a strange irony in that, in the military, we need hierarchy, we need discipline. But, the reason that the soldiers rebelled, went the thinking, was that they were, disgruntled, not receiving enough leave. So, police might need that too, but their jobs aren't as hard as those of the military soldiers. So, so there was the kind of crucial declaration. You can see this in the 1860 report itself, that police would require fewer reliefs from duty. So basically, they were going to be doing more work with less rest and for a lower cost. And if they protested, well, there was plenty of labor to go around, so they were easily replaceable. There was also a way, of course, in which this was racialized. And so it was, this was at a moment in the mid-late 19th century when nativization of the police was happening. So it was, while still the elite, white British colonial officers at the top, it was the people who made up the lower ranks that received the brunt of this. So, of course, it also, there were still these anxieties carrying over from 1857 about discontent. among these indigenous security laborers, right? As one historian who's done some excellent work, Parthapratim Shil, he did his PhD at Cambridge, he finished a couple of years ago. He looked at the colonial security labor market in precisely this period, kind of from 1850 and actually going all the way up to Indian independence in 1947. And he noted how these, what he called post-mutiny panics by colonial administrators, basically about potential rebellions among security laborers, whether they were in the police or the army, these became a perennial problem in the South Asian colonies. This actually, the anxiety around this kind of thing increased, especially at the turn of the century, and in particular following the end of the First World War, which of course, this was a period from 1918 to say the 1920s. There was lots of inflation, a lot of demobilized soldiers all over the globe, as well as a general rise in trade unionism. There was a lot going on. And of course, as we also know, there emerged at the time a very strong anti-colonial nationalist movement in South Asia. So it was around this time also that police unions started forming in places like Madras, what's now the Indian state of Bihar, and several other places. And these unions were starting to kind of join in with some of the nationalist anti-colonial protests, but they were also, working around an identity as police, where they would engage in what Schill, the historian I just mentioned, called strike threats. So, they were basically using the power of rumor, and, they'd sometimes have secret meetings. They would take strike oaths. There were these ways in which the constables in this moment in the early 1920s would threaten a strike or work stoppage, but it never actually came to pass. They would usually get some kind of appeasement before an actual strike happened. But this kind of kept the anxiety among governing elites at a fever pitch, and led directly to a law in 1922 called the Police Incitement to Disaffection Act, which is still being used today against police unionists, especially several that I've been following. Just less than 2 years ago now, there were two police union leaders in the state of Uttar Pradesh who were detained for exactly a year under the National Security Act, as well as for allegedly being in violation of this 1922 Incitement to Disaffection Act. There had been an incident where several constables in Uttar Pradesh were charged with murder for killing a civilian, and thousands of police across the state, they didn't rise up in the usual kind of protest, but there was a lot of posting on social media. I can show some pictures later if you like, where basically the police were saying, that their colleagues were being unjustly thrown under the bus. But the brunt of the state punishment came down on these two police union leaders who were never produced in court. One of them did file a habeas corpus writ, but essentially they were just kept in jail for 12 months until I think September of 2019, so just over a year ago. So these things are still, the history is still very much alive. And another key statute, which came up after independence, it's known as the Police Restriction of Rights Act. This came up in 1966. It was tabled by Parliament and ratified by Parliament, the Indian National Parliament. Essentially, it bans police personnel from in any way publicly criticizing the government, or from founding or joining any organization that's not recognized as part of the police force, or is not, as they say, of a purely social, recreational, or religious nature. And this act, this 1966 Restriction of Rights Act, I still can't get over the name. It came into being actually following several reports of indiscipline among police in Delhi that were associated with a group called the Delhi Police Non-Gazetted Karmachari Sangh, or Non-Gazetted Police Workers Union, which reportedly became active as early as 1964, and actually tried to register with the National Labor Commission, but failed. So as this was going on in the late 1960s, there was another group in the state where I work, Uttar Pradesh, that was forming. They called themselves the Rajya Police Karmachari Parishad, or the State Police Workers Council or Workers Union. I'll just call them the RPKP. And the RPKP claimed to have, at one point, some 30,000 members across the state that were either giving monetary support, a kind of union dues, or at least expressing some kind of moral support. And they were actually able to register, not with the Labor Commission, but they registered themselves as an NGO under what's known as the Society Registration Act in India. And this alarmed senior officers so much that they then lobbied the state legislature to essentially ratify this act from 1966. For some reason, it took them 7 years. It's not clear why. Anyway, and so what this meant then was that this union that had just registered itself, suddenly its legality and its legitimacy came into question. And I think they were de-recognized. And then just a couple of months later, in May of 1973, this is when this major uprising that I mentioned at the beginning happened. And there's a whole, I mean, I'm working on a book of just the history of this uprising. There's so much about it that's still in dispute, including even the fallout. But essentially, there were protests, not only on police lines grounds, but also at the Lucknow, the state capital of Uttar Pradesh University. So you actually had these strange bedfellows moments of university students and police constables actually protesting together against oppression. So hundreds of police were, eventually dismissed from service. There were at least 3 sites of shootouts. The national military was called in to disarm the protesting police, and the official number of casualties were 38 people killed. The number of injured has never been settled. But many people that I've interviewed have said that actually many more people died than, officially reported. So again, much remains in dispute about this. And what was, I think, especially interesting about this moment was that it really marked a major shift from discourses about, police disaffection, like in that 1922 act, threatening public disorder and such, toward a much more kind of national security threat logic. Of course, this was also, the height of the Cold War. We're in the early 1970s. But there was, I think, a real shift that made the lawfare, as I'm calling it, from the Indian government become, that much more covert and certainly coercive. So, lots of people thrown in jail. Some of the unionists from this RPKP, they were, some of them were in jail for over 4 years. And to this day, they're still working. I've actually interviewed several times now, or I'm kind of in regular touch with someone who was the general secretary of this Uttar Pradesh Police Union. His name is Ramashish Rai. And so he says, yep, I've had people working underground for the last 4 decades. There have been attempts to memorialize the police who died in 1973. And I'll just show you a few pictures. I hope I can get the screen share thing to work just to give you a sense here. Oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I don't know, Ian, if you can fix that. If not, that's okay. Should have checked that first, I guess. No biggie. If we can get it up, I'll show you some of the things that I've found in the archives. Anyway, so what's happened now is, when I first started this project, I thought it was going to be mostly a kind of an archival historical project. But in the last decade or so, I've found that police unionism is alive and well, not only in the state where I work, but all across the country in India. At least half of the states have some kind of active police union working. And it's interesting to also note the variation in the responses of the state government. I can also maybe discuss a little bit more about that in the Q&A. But essentially, I think we can see this as a kind of ongoing and low intensity lawfare with occasional flare-ups between various branches of the Indian state and a host of struggling and certainly very fragmented groups like the RPKP and others that are trying to establish themselves as legal and legitimate unions. So I think I'm about out of time. I just want to say, in terms of what do we do with all of this? And what does it mean, especially in this, in this current moment where there's so much debate around how policing globally can be reformed, how that should work in terms of resource allocation or detasking, demilitarizing. I think it's fair to say that certainly based on this case study, and I think there are others, if people know of similar kinds of situations in other world regions, I'd love to hear about it. I think it's fair to say that lawfare as a kind of relational praxis certainly limits the way that all of us can think about police reform, about what's possible. And so one thing that I think this suggests is that we do need to create different kinds of spaces where both people who are working for social justice and in various ways, and police themselves, who we usually think of as the enemy. But I think this case shows us that there are also, ways in which there may be a convergence of police, when we think of them as security laborers, a convergence between what they're demanding and what others are demanding too. So I think I'll just stop there, and thank you so much. I'll look forward to your questions in the discussion.
Thanks very much, Bea. I've now managed to click the right button. So if you did just quickly want to share anything,
oh yeah,
we can do that before we go into the Q&A.
All right. Okay. Cool. All right.
Apologies for that.
Okay. Can everyone? Let's see. I think I have to do slideshow. Okay. Everyone see this? All right. There's a weird. Go away. Okay, there we go. Okay. Yeah, I'll just really quickly. This is from a pamphlet that I found in the archives at the Director General's office. It's actually, it's a flyer that is calling people together for a memorial ceremony. It's a memorial for this uprising that happened in 1973. The date on this is actually I think it's around 1979. So 6 years later, they were trying to have a kind of commemorative gathering. And on the tents, there are these sort of tents in the background. Those actually, they say like Kanpur, Agra, Jhansi. These are the different sites where the uprising took place. There were different reports. Some places said there were 11 sites across the state. Some said there were 14. It really wasn't clear how well coordinated this was, or I mean, the constables I interviewed said mostly they just found out about it kind of spontaneously through like on the wireless radio and such. But what I think is so interesting about this is the way it demonstrates that there's this kind of identity forming, you know, a kind of a cultural identity of, you know, of police as laborers whose rights are still not being addressed. So sorry, this is all a bit out of order, but these are actually some photos from the current moment of different groups of police expressing protest. You can see in the upper right, this is just a basic sit-in by some police officers, some in uniform, some in plain clothes. In this case, this was in 2016. They were basically asking for, well, a host of things, but mainly related to leave from work. There's no concept of shift work. They're basically considered to be on call. And so just basic things like an 8-hour shift, equitable numbers of holidays to senior officers, and certainly also hikes in wages and allowances. And I'll just also mention in the lower right-hand corner, you see police with the black armbands. This is a very common mode of just expressing some kind of discontent. In this case, this related to that incident that did put the 2 unionists in jail. And this was shared on social media. So I've got a lot of other stuff, but I'd really love to hear people's questions. So I'm happy to show more, but I don't want to take too much time away from discussion. So I'll just let that
Okay,
go.
thank
Yeah,
you very much. Let me just